let's do some work with Scratch. It'll give us some experience with it, and let's use it to illustrate the 4 kinds of statements you can have in an algorithm, which were sequential, conditional, iterative, and pre-existing or function. So remember that sequential is just a simple command. And right here I've already defined a variable, but I'm going to delete it and redo it. Okay, so let's make a variable and let's call it test and say okay. And we don't have a sprite yet. So if we look at motion or something, we're not going to be able to do anything. So let's get our sprite. I'm going to pick the buffalo. Alright, there he is. So let's have him move. Here's a sequential statement. I'm going to have him move 30 steps. And if I click on it, there he goes. And then I'm going to have him move 10 more. And I'm going to have him turn 15 degrees. And I have to turn 15 degrees back. And let's run it. And let's see. Let's have him move back 10 steps. Minus 10. Okay. Okay, so what we need, let's put another sprite in here, just so that we can see where we are on moving. Okay, so he's sprite 2, but we really want to deal with sprite 1. Sprite 2 is just going to stay there. So let's walk this guy back. So if you can see, he moves back. Let's move him back 40. Okay. So that's him. He's behind that guy. Now let's. These are sequential steps. Let's see what we have in variables. We have our test variable, which you already defined. Let's set it to 0 at the very beginning of this. All right, and then let's change it by 1 at the end. So this would be an example of pre-existing, because this is not test equals test plus 1. And this would be a simple sequential statement. All these are sequential. So let's run it. We set test 0. This over here should end up being 1. Okay, and it does. Move this guy over here. Okay, so we want to do a conditional statement as an example. So that's a control statement. So to click on control. And let's say, let's take this if. And we don't want to include the set test because we're going to do that outside of it. And this guy we'll leave in here. So we're going to say, if the test equals something, so let's get the variable here. Oh, let's get our operators. We want to say, let's say if test is greater than something. All right. So we choose that. These are comparisons. We go back to variables. We're going to take and drag test over here because that's what we're going to compare. And we're going to say if test is greater than 0, then do these things and add 1 to test. So when we set test to 0, we know this is not going to be greater than 0, so none of this should happen. So let's do it. And nothing does happen, and it's set to 0. Let's put some sound in there, just for fun. Let's play sound when it gets in there. And instead of drum, I'm going to make a crash cymbal. Okay, so let's run it. We shouldn't hear anything, and we don't. Okay, so now what we want to do is let's set, if it's greater than -1. Now this time then it should work. So if it's greater than -1, then let's hear the cymbal, and let's move. So here we go. And it is greater than -1. Now we set it back to 1. So when it falls out of this series of commands, the test is equal to 1. Okay, so now what we're going to say, what we want to do is, we're going to say if test is greater than -1, then we want it to do a loop. So it is an iterative statement. Let's click on variables and make a new variable. And let's call it loop, though that's not a good name for a variable. So I'll say okay, and we're going to use that in our control and our looping statement. Okay, so let's say repeat until. So look, notice it's doing this. It's opening it up. And where the white line is, that's where this is going to end. I want to set the test outside. I don't want to keep setting it to 0. So that's what I'm going to do. I set this repeat here. And so I'm going to say repeat until, so we need a condition, we need an operator. Let's say repeat until something equals something. So you say repeat until loop. loop equals something. So let's go back to our variables. Let's drag our loop over to that first part. And we say repeat until loop equals 4. And we need to set our loop to a value that was already set to 0. Let's set it right here. So we're going to start with loop equals 0. And then we're going to want to change it by 1. So let's put it here. So each time it goes through here, it's going to change it by 1. And then let's run it. So we should hear, if loop is set to 0 and we're going to repeat until loop equals 4, and we're adding 1 to the loop each time we go through this inside here, inside this bracket, then we should hear the symbol 4 times. So let's run it. Alright, and then if you look at it, our test value, we change it by 1, which means we're incrementing it by 1, and that is greater than -1. Let's change this value, and let's increment it by -2, which means we're going to be subtracting 2 from it. In that case, we should have this go through, so repeat it 4 times, change the loop by 1. This part will only execute as long as test is greater than -1. Since it's starting at 0, one time after this, one time through this loop is going to stop it, so we should only hear it once. And see, test value is -2, and the value that the conditional statement says if it's greater than -1, well, once it hit -2, is no longer greater than -1. So what we have here is we have set test to 0, which could be considered a pre-existing some kind of function. Set the loop to 0, same thing. Here's a repeat until. This is a loop or an iterative statement. Here's another pre-existing function, because we're not saying loop equals loop plus 1. We're telling it to change it. We don't care what it's doing, how it's doing it. Then we say if. So if is our conditional, and we have a variable here, and you can't just write the word test, it won't work. If test is greater than -1, we can make this anything we want. Actually, we can make this run indefinitely, but I'm not sure how to kill it. So I don't want to do it by accident, but so I'm not going to run it, but you could do that. So we're saying here's our conditional. If test is greater than -1, then here's our sequential statements. Play the symbol, do this move, turn, and move back. And then change the test by -2. So in other words, it's adding -2 to it. And if you look at this bracket, that ends the if condition. And if you look at the second bracket, that ends the repeat or the loop. And so that is how we accomplished those 4 statements in our Scratch. And let's see, it's pretty simple, and actually it's quite a lot of fun. So that's it. If you have any questions, please email me. Otherwise, just enjoy.